Okay, so starting with part 8 of auto rotations, I realized at the very end of part 7 when I was talking about the R22, I didn't mention the 4 speeds that I told you that you need to be aware of. So let's go over those real quickly. In the R22, again, the minimum descent speed is 53 knots. The recommended auto rotation speed is 65 knots. The maximum glide speed is actually 75 knots. And again, if you bring your speed up to 75, raise the collective just a bit to get the RPMs down to 90%. Again, which you would absolutely, under no circumstances, toy with doing at high altitude. All right, because again, remember your blade stall occurs at 80% plus 1% per 1,000 feet. So at high altitude, we're not going to be messing with a 75-90 glide. And then the auto-rotative V&E, which we had to sort of extrapolate based on the power-on V&E and reducing it by about 20%, turned out to be 61 knots. Well, it doesn't take long to figure out that our extrapolated V&E for auto-rotation is actually less than the recommended airspeed for doing an auto-rotation at. So you start getting sort of in an area where you don't want to be, you know. So. All right, so let's continue on. The next aircraft we're going to look at is going to be the 206, good old Bell 206. This is a B model. And again, the 4 speeds that we're looking for. Number one, it's kind of easy. On a 206, if you can remember 60, 70, 80, you got, and that's in miles per hour, not knots, but that's in miles per hour. You know the airspeeds for a 206. So the minimum descent speed is 60 miles per hour. 70 is the recommended auto rotation airspeed, and 80 is your max range airspeed. If you want to convert those to knots, that's 52, 61, and 69 knots. All right. Or just remember 60, 70, 80 in miles per hour. Now to calculate our V&E and auto rotation, again, the V&E and auto rotation for a B model is listed at 100 knots, or the calculated V&E, power on V&E, whichever is less. All right. So if we look at our performance of the Bell 206 B model at 10,000 feet, we're going to have it at 4,150 pounds. Chart looks a little bit busy here, but if you look at it, 10,000 feet, and we'll use 0 instead of -5, but here's 0, and if we slide over to 10,000 feet, it looks like we've got a V&E of about 110. That's a power on V&E of 110. Well, we're limited to 100 knots V&E on the 206. So, but again, we're going to be shooting at doing the auto rotation at 61 to roughly 69 knots, and our V&E and auto rotation is 100 knots. That's a very good margin for safety. Not going to be flirting with hitting the V&E in the 206. All right, how about the 407? Let's take a look at the 407. So what are the speeds in the 407? The minimum descent speed in a 407 is 55 knots. The recommended auto rotation speed is 70 knots, and the max range speed is 80 knots in a 407. So now let's compare our V&E and auto rotation. Again, you'll see down here it says, and this is the V&E chart, but you see it says maximum auto rotation V&E of 100 knots. So just like the 206, the maximum V&E and auto rotation is either 100 knots or the power on V&E, whichever is less. All right. So let's look at what our power on V&E would be at Leadville, Colorado on a standard day, 10,000 feet. So here's our row for 10,000 feet, and we'll use 0 here. Slide across there, and it's 117 knots, right? So again, our auto rotation V&E would be 100 knots, or our power on V&E, whichever is less. So in this case, again, we have a 100 knot V&E for auto rotation at 10,000 feet on a standard day at Leadville, Colorado. Again, and again, we're going to be doing the auto rotation in a 407 at 70 knots, and our V&E in auto rotation is 100 knots. So again, a nice wide margin for safety. All right, well, certainly last and not least, my favorite helicopter to fly is the Huey. I used to fly a UH-1 Huey. That's a few hundred hours in them, and they're literally the most fun you can have with your clothes on. The only bad thing about the Huey is paying for the fuel bill. Right? They burn about 90 to 95 gallons an hour, and you know, with jet fuel about $4 a gallon, it costs you about, you know, $400 an hour to fly around the thing. So, all right, let's talk about the speeds. All right, number one, the minimum descent speed in the Huey. The minimum descent speed in the Huey is actually 45 knots. It's actually 45 knots. It's actually lower than the R22. All right, so minimum descent speed 45 knots. Recommended auto rotation speed is 60 knots, and the max range speed I believe is 80 knots. So so we're going to end up doing our auto rotation somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60 knots or so. All right. So this is our V&E chart, and again, if we look at so the Huey that I used to fly was 5250 empty, max gross was 9,500, and so we're going to look at max gross weight. We're going to look at it 9,500, 10,000 foot pressure altitude up to 9,500, and we slide across. Gives us a V&E of about 90 knots. All right. So again, our V&E is 90 knots, and in the auto rotation, we're only going to be going about 60 knots. Again, so a nice wide margin between the two, right? So realistically, if you're going to be flying at high altitude, and what do I consider high altitude? Really, once you get up past about 7,000 or 8,000 feet, piston helicopters, although they will do it, you can get them up there, but your margins for safety start decreasing fairly significantly, especially when you get even higher than that. Right? So if you're really going to be operating a lot in altitudes that are quite high, you really should consider taking an R66, a turbine helicopter, or one of the other turbine helicopters. The biggest difference between the R66 and the other helicopters is obviously cost. The R66 operating costs are much less than any of the other turbine helicopters, by far.